Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm the Community Engagement Intern with Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light. And I want to thank everyone for coming for today's event, and we're going to get started now. So here are the speakers that we have for this session. I'm just going to let them introduce themselves in the order that it's here. So Zach, you can start us off.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Zach Schalk. I am the Indiana Program Director for Solar United Neighbors. I am based here in Indianapolis. Would you like me to say a little bit about Solar United Neighbors, or is that enough of an introduction for now?
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, sure. So for those of you who are not familiar with Solar United Neighbors, we are a national 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have on-the-ground programs in 12 states. And we are dedicated to helping Hoosiers go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights so that we can create a clean and equitable 21st century energy system that distributes benefits and control to local communities. And we think rooftop solar is at the cornerstone of creating that new and transformed energy system. So really excited to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to answer some questions today.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Great to be with you all. Thank you for the invitation, Sarah and Dory. My name is Jesse Corbanda. I'm Executive Director of the Hoosier Environmental Council. I felt tempted to say that my nickname is Zach so that we could have three Zachs on today's program. The Hoosier Environmental Council, if you're not familiar with it, is a 37-year-old public interest organization that is headquartered in Indianapolis, although we work statewide. And we have three pillars of the organization: to improve environmental health, to protect land and water, and to advance a sustainable economy. And energy policy issues most certainly intersect all those issues, and I know that will come through in the course of our discussion. I'll just top line that the two areas in energy that we most work on are coal ash, which is the industrial waste that comes out of coal plants, for which Indiana has more coal ash dumps than any state in America. And then the other initiative is related to rooftop solar, work that is very complementary to the excellent work of our friends at Solar United Neighbors. And it's very focused on trying to raise the visibility of solar energy in conservative areas of our state, since it's so critical to win over conservatives in order to move public policy in Indiana.
Well, thank you both for sharing. I don't believe Zach Elliott will be able to join us, but we have you both, so it should be great. So moving on to the programs, we're going to be talking about misconceptions surrounding renewable energy. So for the first one, it is that renewable energy does not deliver reliable energy on demand. Which one of you wants to start?
Sure, I can go ahead and jump in here a little bit. This is definitely something that we encounter quite a bit, both in discussions with individual homeowners who are interested in going solar, and perhaps more importantly with in discussions with legislators who are potentially resistant to the idea of the renewable energy transition. I think this question has a bit of resonance with folks, because at a certain level, there is truth to it. If you put solar panels on your roof and it's a cloudy day, or hopefully every day there's night where the sun isn't shining, your panels will not be producing electricity. But when it comes to rooftop solar, the real way for folks to consider, what they're investing in is that during the day, their panels will be producing electricity, and at night, they'll be connected to the grid. So they'll still have electricity from the grid, or they can install a battery storage system that will store the extra electricity they have generated during the day to be used at a point in time when their panels are not producing electricity. We primarily focus on the smaller scale installations, but there are definitely also ways for the benefits of renewable energy, beyond solar, to complement each other to balance out electricity production on a much larger scale than the household. And maybe that's a good transition for Jesse to take a stab at this question.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Yeah, Zach certainly answered that really well in the distributed generation context. And yeah, speaking it from a transmission perspective, I think the most powerful statistic that one could give, that you can have reliable electricity while powering a modern economy that has industrial plants, that has large agricultural facilities, that has plenty of commercial buildings, is to look at what's happened in the Great Plains areas. In Iowa, they get 37% of their electricity from renewable energy. In Kansas, they get 36% of their electricity from renewable energy. In other states like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Oklahoma, it hovers around 30%. And there are not brownouts that are happening, or rolling blackouts that are happening in any of those states. And the reason is because the transmission grid operators are so sophisticated that they know when they have good forecasting tools to anticipate when they're going to be, when wind is going to be at its peak and when it's not going to be at its peak, and to make sure that other elements of the system, like Zach said, are balancing out those fluctuations in wind and solar.
The one last thing I would want to add is that when we envision a clean energy system with renewables, delivering that energy, we are envisioning something that it's not just a one solution. It's not just wind. It's not just solar. It's all different types of renewable energy sources producing the energy when and where they can, and then incorporating that energy into an integrated system of battery storage, of electric vehicles, of interdependent microgrids, and then also on the demand side, using energy efficiency, which Zach from IPL I think would have been able to speak to much better than I can, but using energy efficiency approaches to reduce our overall demand and change the times at which we need electricity to better align with when our renewable sources are able to produce it and dispatch that electricity efficiently. So I think the kind of, there's a reality of where we are today, and then there's a long-term vision. And that long-term vision is coming closer and closer every day. And it's really a matter of when, not if, our energy system will become hopefully 100% reliable on purely renewable sources.
Thank you both for sharing. Does anyone else have any questions on this topic particularly? All right, we can move on to the next one. And this one is that renewable energy is expensive. Ooh, my bad.
Well, I can take a crack at that. I know Zach will have more to add, but just the short answer is that the economics of any kind of technology are going to change over time. And when you're looking at solar energy in the 1970s or 80s, that's going to be a totally different picture from that of the present time. And big picture wise, why have prices gone down precipitously for something like solar or wind? The answer is that it is because of innovation in R&D, and it is because, for example, the improving efficiency of converting the sun's energy into electric power, and then of course economies of scale. And the real major mover in terms of changing the price of solar was when China got into the field. When German solar energy engineers started to provide technical assistance in China, and all of a sudden China's industry took off, and it led to a dramatic reduction in the price of solar per watt. And so now you have a situation where wind, for example, on a per megawatt hour basis without subsidies is beating coal and is beating certain kinds of natural gas, certain natural gas systems. And we can talk about, okay, well, is it fair to compare is this an apples to apples comparison? We can talk a little bit about that. But the fact of the matter is these factors, R&D, innovation, and economies of scale have really driven down the price of renewable energy.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jesse said. And I think the only thing I would add, well, I guess two things. One is about the time horizon that we're talking about. Is renewable energy expensive? So again, to focus back in on what Solar United Neighbors really has experience with, which is rooftop solar. If you just look at the dollar amount of installing solar on your roof in a pure vacuum, sure, it can look like a big number, but when you put it in context of the electricity bills that you pay every month right now, and what your savings will be over the lifetime of that energy source, then it starts, suddenly it's not so expensive at all. It's an investment that generates a return. So context is really important with this question. And I think the other thing is to think about, when you're using that energy over time, do you want to have an energy source where you constantly have to keep paying for not just maintenance and upkeep, but also for the actual fuel itself? Or do you want the sun to do it for you? You don't have to pay for sunshine. It's right there. It's what allows us to grow all the corn here in this state. We might as well harvest some of that sunshine for electricity as well. And the last point I want to make here is that Jesse is absolutely right that especially at the large scale, wind and solar are the cheapest forms of electricity generation on the market. But I think that it's also important for us to view the social value of especially distributed generation as an important feature of a potential future energy system, and not shy away from that scary S word of subsidy, and not shy away from the fact that we should put our money where our values are and invest in distributed clean resources that allow for a more equitable energy system that puts money in people's pockets, also reduces overall system costs by generating electricity close to where it's used, in addition to all of the environmental and health benefits that come with that. So I think that for a long time, the kind of renewable energy advocates have been in something of a defensive crouch because of the subsidies that have certainly helped to propel adoption of renewable energy, along with and help to create the market that helped to power the innovation and the scale that Jesse talked about. But I think that's not something we should shy away from. We should embrace it, because renewable energy in and of itself is a good. And as a society, we should advocate fiercely for those goods, and we should push our public officials to make sure those goods are adopted at a reasonable cost.
Thank you both. Does anyone have any questions on this topic?
You're talking about subsidies. Those go to whom?
I guess it depends. So there are, for solar, I'm much more familiar with the solar tax credits that are available. So that, there are tax credits available for a homeowner who installs solar panels. There are also tax credits available for businesses, and including larger developers. So that's one form that is typically, considered a subsidy. The discussion around what's a subsidy and what isn't is very complicated. When you dig into the details, you can talk about manufacturing subsidies. On the extractive resources side, you can talk about the fact that we give obscene, grants to companies that are extracting resources like oil, gas, and coal from our public lands. So there's a lot to unpack in the discussion of subsidies, and your question definitely gets to the point of it: who gets the subsidy? But I guess it's kind of difficult to answer in a very straightforward way. So I don't know, maybe Jesse has a better concise answer than I delivered.
Chris and I live in a building that has 50 individual condos in it. We have a homeowners association, which is of course incorporated under Indiana law. We're a nonprofit, so we don't qualify for any tax deductions or anything like that. So is there anything you're aware of that might help us make it more easier to get to?
Unfortunately, not really. Here in Indiana, we don't make it easy for people to go solar. There are more avenues, both for individual installations, like financing individual installations, as well as options like community solar or shared solar that allow you to benefit on your electric bill as if you had solar on your roof that you owned personally, that are not available here in Indiana. And I think this also speaks to some of the limitations, not just our local policies, which we are behind a lot of the country in that, but also our national policies in that the tax credits that are available are non-refundable. So you have to have a large enough tax bill to even benefit from it in the first place. So it's really, even though it does reduce the cost of solar, it only reduced the cost of solar for somebody who's wealthy enough to be able to realize those benefits on their existing tax bill. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to make access to solar in particular much more equitable and inclusive, and bring the technology and benefits within reach of more of our neighbors.
Thank you.
I believe there was a question in the chat that was brought up, which was, what is the impact on the environment for extracting resources to produce solar panels?
That's a good question. This really illuminates a broader point about renewable energy, that we cannot have a romantic notion of any technology. Every technology has its rewards and its risks. And certainly with something like solar energy, these solar panels will often involve a number of different minerals. And of course, that means that you've got to either find, you've got to penetrate into the recycled or reused market, or you've got to get virgin materials. And obviously, if you go the route of virgin materials, then it could involve a tremendous amount of mining, which, generically speaking, regardless of the mineral, can be quite harmful in terms of air and water impacts. And I know that entities like the World Bank, which probably strikes various emotions among people who are listening in, has a dedicated initiative to trying to figure out how to decarbonize mining in the anticipation, as reflected by the U.S. Energy Information Administration or the international bodies that monitor growth, that because renewables is going to be a much larger percentage of the mix, partly driven by public policy in places like the European Union and China, and hopefully one day in the United States, there's going to be a surge of new mining. And so how do we make sure that we decarbonize mining so that the life cycle costs of producing electricity from solar or wind is as minimal as possible? I'm not answering that in a very specific way, and the reason why that's hard is just because there's so many different types of minerals that are extracted for purposes of creating solar and wind turbines, solar units and wind turbines.
Yeah, I would just follow up with that to say first that a big part of the price decrease that we've seen in solar panels and the innovation that Jesse talked about earlier was possible because the panels themselves use far fewer of the expensive and rare earth minerals than they used to. So as the panels have become more efficient, we're using less of the stuff that's hard to get and is most harmful to mine. But I think it's absolutely a fair question to ask and something that the industry has to continue to improve on for all the reasons Jesse mentioned. I think that the other thing I want to add is I don't know about the statistics on wind, but I know that the carbon, like the full carbon life cycle for solar panels, several years ago passed into, even as carbon intensive as it is to produce the panels, you will save more over the lifetime of the panels because of the clean electricity they're generating than goes into producing the panels. So that's one thing. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there are, in Europe, where the solar market is much more further developed, so there are more panels that are being taken out of commission than there are here in the United States, where our market is much newer and there just aren't very many solar panels that are reaching the end of their life cycle yet. There are far more advanced efforts and some mandates even about recycling the panels themselves, which will hopefully both extend the life cycle and reduce the overall negative, or further reduce the impact that the life cycle of solar panels have on the environment, speaking more holistically. There are a lot of challenges with that because in addition to using fewer of these valuable and rare earth minerals, they're further integrated in a way that makes it harder to kind of extract them and use them again in the future in the recycling process. But that's something that the U.S. industry is certainly just kind of starting to get its act together on. Again, just because there isn't much of a recycling market yet, because most of the panels are still in use. Like the vast majority of the panels are still in use. And I think I saw somebody else in the chat ask about the lifetime of solar panels. So I'll just speak to that really quickly. The industry standard is 25 years. That's generally what the production warranty and oftentimes what the equipment warranty lasts for. But there are panels on that are still online that have been producing electricity since the 70s. So they just get less efficient as time goes on and as the materials that are responsible for converting the solar radiation into direct current electricity become worn down or used up. The panels themselves get less efficient. So the rule of thumb in the back of your head is 25 to 30 years is generally what we think of as the lifetime of solar panels.
Another question that came up was asked that if there is any harm in large solar and wind fields, and when it comes to replacing agricultural use as well as ecologically.
Sure. Great question. Very important question. Before I dive into that question, it's worth just taking a minute to really fully appreciate again just how damaging the current way that we produce energy is. And of course, that's not to dig at the hardworking people who've been involved in the industry or the intelligence that it's involved in creating it. But coal, which of course has historically been the dominant source of electricity, has such profound impacts on the environment. You think about the fact that we get a good portion, and from an American perspective, we get a good portion of our electricity, our coal, from the Appalachian areas. And in West Virginia alone, they have lost 500 mountains due to mountaintop removal since the 1970s. 3,200 streams have been contaminated in West Virginia alone because of mountaintop removal. And then you think about all the different aspects of the process of producing electricity from coal. You've got to then ship that coal to power plant, which could lead to fugitive dust from these coal trains getting into the air, hurting our lungs. And then, of course, we know about the mercury and the sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide that comes from these coal plants. And then the coal ash, which I alluded to at the beginning of my comments, which can lead to contamination of groundwater. And that's something that's been verified by the utility's own data. Then you've got situations of then shipping that mine potentially across the globe, as is very much being wanted to be done by China, where they want to import coal from the United States and Canada. And just think about all the harm that can do too. So it's worth recapitulating the impact of coal on the environment to really put in perspective this issue of solar and wind. Solar and wind does have impacts on the environment, these utility scale plants. But again, we have to look at the full life cycle of coal versus the life cycle of solar and wind. So very briefly, with respect to wind, obviously one of the real concerns is birds and bats. And the talking point that is often raised is, well, we lose billions of birds to cats and billions of birds to buildings. And that's one way of looking at it, where the number that are killed by wind turbines is much less than that of cats and by buildings. In fact, I take a walk every day in downtown Indy and I will see birds as I walk, and it's a really tragic example, expression of that reality. But really, to be fair in our thinking about this, the fact of the matter is it's certain types of birds and certain types of mammals that are hurt by wind turbines, and that's a legitimate concern. Hawks and other raptors. You've got bats, for which we have some endangered species right here in Indiana. So these are very legitimate concerns that cannot be marginalized. And the way to mitigate that would be through design innovation and through operation. And I don't want to hog my answer to this question, but we can talk a little bit more about that if people are curious. But there are serious things being done on the design and operation side to minimize harm to birds and bats. With respect to solar, one of the things that really jumps out at you is, again, just how profound the land impact of solar farms are. I've been working a little bit to try to influence decision-making in Randolph County in East Central Indiana related to plans to build the largest ever solar farm in Indiana. It will be 10 times bigger than the existing solar farm. And it will entail the use of 1,300 acres of land. And that land is in southwest Randolph County, which actually has some really good woodlands and is considered a conservation priority for our friends at the Red Tail Conservancy. So the critical thing there is to make sure that that utility scale solar farm is as wildlife friendly as possible. And again, we can talk about that more if folks are interested.
Thank you for answering. One more question came up in the chat and then we'll go back to the slides, but how many miners have died from black lung, if either of you know? No.
Yeah, I don't know that offhand, but I mean, again, that's a great question. Whoever posed that, it's just tragic that, it's just tragic. And there are claims being filed, new fresh claims that are being filed related to black lung disease today, even though the industry switched over to a totally different form of coal mining back in the 70s.
Well, thank you both for answering. We'll go on to the third one. And the third one is renewable energy sources create less energy than it takes to build them, which was kind of discussed previously, but.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I can't speak to other forms of renewable energy. There are a lot of differences, and I really only know about solar, but I can definitely say that solar panels over the lifetime of their, their generation, there are many studies that show that they definitely are produced today. The panels that are being produced and installed today produce much more electricity or much more energy than it takes to produce them. That what hasn't always been true, and I know that there are definitely still folks who point to old data from the early 2010s when that wasn't true. But it's been a couple years now. I'm sorry I don't have the exact year off the top of my head, but the panel efficiency and the energy capacity of the panels that are on the market now, I'll make that statement true today, and their extended lifetime as well.
All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding this statement? All right, we can go to the next one, which is clean coal is a great alternative to the status quo.
Sure, I can speak to that, and I think you all would probably have a sense of my perspective on this. Let's first of all try to get a consensus definition on what clean coal is. First of all, obviously it's a misnomer to call it clean coal, because the implication of calling it clean coal is that it's somehow free of all the different air, water, and greenhouse gas impacts. But so that's one way to think about this, that it's just not credible to claim that a technology is clean. That's misleading. But to be fair to the industry, in terms of how we think about it, it is a fact that coal generation with respect to air emissions has become cleaner over time. Scrubbers have been added to coal plants that have reduced precipitously particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, mercury. That has happened. But even if we isolate how we think about coal to that perspective, all of a sudden, what happens with what you've essentially trapped from being emitted in the atmosphere? You've converted it to a solid waste. So that solid waste would either have to go to a coal ash dump, which again, Hoosier Environmental Council is very focused on, or it would need to go to a hazardous waste facility. So the pollution problem is there. It's just been shifted to a different medium. The other thing to think about is that even though you've seen a significant reduction in air emissions from cleaner coal technologies, which again is somewhat offset by the amount of solid waste that's generated, you still have all of the different devastation that's caused by the mining of coal. And then you still have the reality that these plants are emitting enormous amounts of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And the thing is, there are only 2 plants in the entire world. There are only 2 coal plants in the entire world that have carbon capture and sequestration. Just 2 in the entire world. And ones for which they tried to effectuate what's called CCS, or carbon capture and sequestration. The most recent and noteworthy projects have failed. One that happened right in our neighbors, Illinois, PowerGen, that is a failure. It never got built. And then perhaps the most tragic example is in one of the lowest income states in America, in Mississippi, the great state of Mississippi. Kemper was built there, and it posited to be this marquee example of a coal plant that had carbon capture and sequestration. The projected cost of the plant was $2 billion. They have now spent $7 billion on the project, and guess what? They decided not to advance either the coal gasification technology or the carbon capture and sequestration technology, even after spending $7 billion in a state that has a very high percentage of poor people. So this is not a great alternative to the status quo. It's an economically irresponsible alternative. And of course, it's an environmentally irresponsible alternative to the status quo.
Does anyone have any questions about this statement? All right, you can go to the next one, which is that renewable energy is worthless without government incentives.
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think that it's easy in our mainstream discourse to get caught up in dollars and cents, and I think this kind of goes to what I was talking about earlier. In addition to the market being on our side now, with renewable energies of wind and solar being the cheapest forms of electricity on the market, it provides all kinds of other environmental, public health, and social benefits. So even if large scale wind and solar were more expensive, I would still be advocating for it because it's good. It's good for reducing the amount of carbon emissions that come from our energy system. And at the smaller scale, it's good for reducing, reducing how expensive people's electric bills are. It's good for creating good paying local jobs. It's good for improving public health with cleaner air and drinking water. So there's a whole host of benefits that even without any kinds of economic considerations, in my mind, make a strong case for investing in renewable energies. So that's my case, and I'm sticking to it.
Does anyone have any questions regarding this statement? All right, we'll go to the next one, which is that the renewable energy sector has low employment opportunities.
Sure, I'll take a go at answering that. I'm sure Zach will have more to say. But this is really one of the striking great strands of what is happening in America today. Obviously, there's a lot of doom and gloom, the 40 million people who filed for unemployment and so forth. But when we think ahead over the next 20 to 50 years, one of the growth sectors will without questionably be renewable energy. And the thing is, it is having a profound impact on the job market even today. There are about more than 350,000 people who are employed in solar. There's less than 60,000 people that are employed in coal mining. There are about 120,000 people who are employed in the wind industry. And again, we're talking about just in the United States. And there are orders of magnitude more people employed in China than the United States. And of course, it is a bigger country, but they have made a serious, concerted commitment to changing federal policy with respect to energy. And that's something that is an elusive goal, and something that I know our friends at Citizens Climate Lobby and other places are really working hard to achieve a national carbon policy, which is critical to even growing that sector faster.
Yeah, and I just dropped in the chat a report that actually just came out earlier this week. It's an annual report called Clean Jobs Midwest. This takes it doesn't just include renewable energy sector, but kind of a more holistic view of clean energy jobs. But I think this really speaks to the broad base of employment, both in the renewable energy sector and clean energy more broadly considered. Obviously, these numbers are from 2019, and we have seen a significant drop in employment in the renewable energy sector in 2020, just like everybody else that's been impacted. But I think that the future is definitely clear in that renewable energy offers an increasing amount of future employment opportunities. For several years running, wind and solar installers have been at or near the top of the Department of Labor's fastest growing jobs list. So, and that trend is only continuing. There's a lot, as I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot more we can do here in Indiana to make sure we're able to capitalize on on those opportunities and make sure those opportunities are available here. But even today, with kind of our limited support for these industries, there's ample employment opportunities both today and in the future.
Thank you both for answering that. There's these two questions that came up. One of them was that is enough being spent on, I'm not sure what R&D stands for. Rosemary, if you would like to talk about your question.
Research and development.
Gotcha. Is enough being spent on research and development given the potential, especially for solar?
No. No, there's definitely more that we should be doing as a nation to be pursuing advancements in technology and solar and in battery storage and other ways to reduce carbon impacts of our energy system and increase our potential for getting more of our energy needs met by clean and renewable sources. And it's a very popular issue. If you look across every public survey that's done, this across all kinds of party or ideological identification, investment in research and development into renewable energies pulls extremely highly up. I think in the 90 percentile or 90% in favorable and Democratic or liberal circles, and I think in some surveys that I've seen 80+% in Republican or conservative self-identified responders as well. So I think the bigger issue here is of people are view research and development into renewable energy favorably, but it's not necessarily something that they're passionate about. So it's not something that they're going and advocating for, fighting for, and really pushing the policy dial in the direction it needs to go. But we Solar United Neighbors, I can only speak for us, but I know that we are absolutely fighting for a whole menu of renewable energy investments to be included in any kind of further economic recovery packages that are coming at the national level, to include, in addition to direct, put solar panels on roofs policies, to include further research and development to stimulate, future market advancements.
If I could follow up, Zach, what's the primary obstacle? I mean, would it have to come from the federal government, or why can the private sector not? Is it not economically feasible for the private sector to put more into R&D?
I think the scale of investment that's required necessitates public investment. To Jesse's point earlier, China made an affirmative choice to invest in a policy of not just research and development, but just an industrial policy. That this is a thing we're going to do, and we're going to, build at scale that drives down cost. And in Germany, they had an engineering side, but they also had policies that helped to create a market to soak up all of those new panels. And so, without going too far down a rabbit hole, we have a political system federally that views money as a scarce resource as opposed to a tool that we can use to meet our needs. And so, that is, I think the restraint is more of an ideological one than it is a physical one.
Yeah, I just add one more point to Zach's, which is just to spotlight that I think there's a real national imperative to invest in storage. Storage to me seems to be the holy grail for achieving dramatic reductions in carbon emissions in our country and across the globe. I mean, you think about the fact that electric vehicles, there are new players going into the market, right? You've got Nissan, you've got Ford, you've got GM, and of course you've got Tesla. And it's inevitable. And then you've got all the Chinese companies that are, for which penetration of electric vehicles in their market is much higher than it is in the US. So that industry, by virtue of just sheer competition, is going to lead to reductions in prices in electric vehicles and lead to innovation in battery technology. But again, there's this urgency to decarbonize the power sector. And yes, we have been able to have renewable energy occupying 30 to 40% of a given state's electricity grid. Again, Iowa being a great example in our country. But there are concerns about, can we reach higher levels through the existing model? And that's where you need to have utility scale storage. So yes, to your point, Rosemary, I mean, there's venture capitalists that are investing in various different technologies in the solar storage space. But if you look at, history about the ratios of federal investment to private sector investment, I mean, the former has historically been much larger than the latter. We, of course, saw that in the space race and in the Cold War. And we've got to figure out a way, even if our debt is extremely high, disturbingly high in this country, this is one of those areas where I think it would be a great return on taxpayer investment to spend more on storage.
And I agree with that wholeheartedly, that storage is absolutely where it's kind of the key missing ingredient. And the one thing I would add is that I think further investment in behind the meter customer owned, or at least customer located storage is also really, really exciting. And there's some really, a couple examples I'd like to highlight of where I think the future energy system could be going. And one is Green Mountain Power, which is an investor-owned utility, but in Vermont, that is in the process of expanding a pilot program where they either allow customers to invest in solar, or I'm sorry, in battery storage at their homes with some incentives, or will allow the customer to pay a small addition on their monthly bill to have battery storage installed at their home, that then the utility manages and can pull from in order to reduce costs for everybody, and also to provide service during grid outages. So that's one really exciting example that's in the process of being expanded. The other is a company called Sunrun, is working right now to bring the first what are called virtual power plants online, where they're pairing rooftop solar and home battery storage together to be treated in aggregate across thousands of homes in different utility territories as electricity generation resource that can be dispatched, and just like a coal plant, or just like a solar farm somewhere else. And that combination of distributing at each individual home level, it's a relatively small amount of energy that's been stored there, but in aggregate, it can create a much larger impact, and is much closer to being like a real deployable resource than a large utility scale battery. And especially to get back to our question about the resource intensiveness of the renewable energy sector, that's really, in my mind, where the research and development can come into play, because when we're talking about battery chemistries right now, there's a lot of toxic minerals and other kind of bad things that are required, and a lot of resource extraction that goes into electric vehicle batteries and battery storage technology. But there are some really exciting advancements being made that would, if not completely remove the majority of those kind of negative aspects, and really open up a much more exciting future of a truly renewable energy system.
Another question popped up in the chat that said, generally speaking, how transferable are a worker's skills if their gas or coal jobs get converted to wind or solar?
That's a good question, and I think it seems like it'd be a little bit hard to say, in the sense that there would be no generic job in coal mining, right? There are people who are involved in excavating coal. There are people involved in setting up the detonation, there'd be people involved in, if it's a subsurface mine, involved in electricity, setting up electricity there. So there's a variety of different skill sets that come into play in coal. But there's no question that there are certain states like West Virginia that have set up programs whereby you train unemployed coal miners in other fields. Some of them have gone into renewable energy. I know that one of the somewhat redeeming aspects of renewable energy in the West Virginia context has been that they have actually put wind turbines on top of the places that are now closed mountaintop mines. So even though it's stripped bare of this vegetation and wildlife is gone, at least that land can be somewhat redeemed by putting on wind turbines, putting up wind turbines. And so you've got folks who were in the coal industry that are working in the small but growing wind turbine industry in West Virginia. Another area they've gone into is coding, since coal mining can have real technical complexity. So some people have gone into coal mining, and then some have gone into healthcare. And unfortunately, partly to deal with the tragic number of black lung disease folks who have black lung disease in West Virginia.
Thank you for answering that question. Two questions came up for the past section that were not addressed, so I'm just going to bring them up now. And it was, can you compare the subsidy cost of solar to other energy subsidies?
There are definitely reports and studies that offer that comparison. I don't have any readily available at my fingertips, but that's something I can try to access and can share with the group for folks who are interested.
And then the other question is, how do incentives for renewable energy compare to oil and gas subsidies?
Yeah, those are tough. Those are really tough questions, and they're moving targets. Bryce dropped in a great link to the Energy Environmental Working Group, which has done work in energy subsidies. Another think tank that's done work in that arena is the Environmental Law Institute. The problem is it's hard to really monetize these things because there's been so much policy instability. So for example, with the wind industry, the main federal incentive is called the production tax credit. And the problem is that it has been so erratic. It will lapse for a year. Then you've got a whole bunch of bipartisan lawmakers who will get it extended by 2 years. Then it'll lapse again. Then it'll be extended for 5 years. Then it'll lapse again. And then it'll be extended for a short period of time. So it's simply hard to monetize. But there's no question that the so-called negative externalities on a per megawatt hour basis of fossil fuels are higher than renewable energy because, again, if you look at it from every stage of the process, from the extraction to the decommissioning, if you look at things from a total life cycle perspective, again, the harm that's caused to the environment is much greater on a per megawatt hour basis of fossil fuels versus renewables. And that matters in terms of this conversation on subsidies, because effectively it is poor communities, oftentimes, both rural, predominantly white communities that are low income, and then African American and other people of color communities in urban areas that are bearing the price and essentially incurring, essentially subsidizing the cost of power by virtue of their sacrificing their health, right? I mean, if you're living in Appalachia and you're a worker, you're getting exposed to black lung disease. If you are a resident, it's possible that you might have mining tailing pond deposition going into your private well. So you're paying a price that that essentially keeps coal artificially low, because the the company isn't internalizing the array of costs that it's imposing on society. Those costs are being borne, aka subsidized, by the residents of that community.
Thank you both for answering. I'm going to go on to the next statement, which is that renewable energy isn't good for the environment, which we touched on a bit, but
yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say a couple quick points here, and I know Zach will have more to say. One is that it is hard to really concisely answer this question, because the question is, what do you mean by impact on the environment? Are you looking at it from a carbon emission standpoint? Are you looking at it from the perspective of one type of toxin? This is hard. But once again, if you look at renewable energy versus fossil fuels on a life cycle basis with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy has a lower life cycle impact than fossil fuels does. And then within renewables, they vary in terms of their life cycle impact. Interestingly, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for which they are probably citing an underlying research source, wind has the lowest carbon life cycle impact of all the major renewable energy technologies. Then comes hydro, then comes geothermal, and then comes solar. And I think that's partly gets at this issue of how much mining has to happen for solar to take place. And I guess one very concise point I want to say about this is that our position at the Hoosier Environmental Council is, for any type of energy technology, renewables or fossil fuels, the point is simple: internalize the cost that you're imposing on society. If you're internalizing the cost, we can get an accurate picture of the price that is paid by a certain technology. So in other words, if instead of letting a coal mining company essentially potentially contaminate the groundwater of the neighbors around the coal mine, have stringent enough regulations that they don't they don't cause damage to other people. And if you do that, then we truly get at the true price of electricity of various different sources. By the same token, and to be fair, for a wind turbine, you don't want to put it where it could be in the path of migratory birds. And that will mean more stringent setbacks. And that could maybe increase the cost of producing that wind farm, because you might be having to pay higher land prices because you have less land to choose from. But let's be honest about every technology that we pursue, that we internalize the cost at every step so that we truly get the authentic price of each of these as sources of electricity.
I think, Jesse, you kind of touched on the main things there. The only thing I would say for those of you, on the call who might get this question is to kind of respond with another question: compared to what? As we've kind of been describing, yes, there is an impact on the environment, but comparatively, renewable energy is definitely a step in the right direction. And I think we, as activists and advocates, should continue demanding that the industry improves their practices and reduces the environmental harm as we continue to advance towards a clean, equitable, and just future for our energy system and our society as a whole. But if we don't take action today with the technology we have, we won't have that future to be debating about what the impact will look like 20, 30 years down the road. So there's always room for improvement, and I think people should absolutely continue to demand improvement. But renewable energy absolutely is better than what we have right now.
thank you both for sharing. Does anyone have questions? All right, we can go to the next one. Solar only works when the sun is out, and turbines only work when it's windy out.
Sure, I can start here. We've kind of talked about this a little bit. I mean, you know, the real kind of answer to this as well. It's not universally, you know, when it's sunny over here, it's probably it might be cloudy over here, but the wind is probably blowing. You know, so this is where wind, solar, hydro, other renewable energies kind of work together to form a collective whole and have complementary features that balance themselves out. And then also where battery storage technology becomes very important. So this kind of speaks to one of the benefits of a renewable energy future is the potential for a truly diversified energy system that doesn't rely on extraction or a single potential point of failure, but relies on energy being produced from any number of sources across you know, the community that's being served, and taking advantage of the natural resources that are available in that area.
Thank you for answering that question. Does anyone have questions on this statement? Moving on to the next one. Geothermal energy releases toxic gases from the earth.
Well, first of all, it depends upon the type of geothermal system, closed loop versus open loop. And open loop definitely does emit problematic emissions, such as hydrogen sulfide and ammonia and methane and boron. But the emissions on a per megawatt hour basis or per kilowatt hour basis are actually 30 times less than a fossil fuel plant.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone have any questions on this statement? All right, we'll go to the next one. I believe this is the last one for this session. And it is that coal alleviates energy poverty.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at this. Again, I'm sure Zach will have things to say. Let's first of all talk about energy poverty. What does that mean? This is something that we can probably most visualize when we think about the developing world and the fact that we have on the order of 1 billion people around the planet that do not have access to electricity, and more than 2 billion people around the planet who do not have reliable access to energy, electricity. It turns out that about 85% of those people are in rural parts of the developing world, places like India and Africa. And those are people whose electricity is very unlikely not going to be powered by coal if a electric utility is trying to be smart about their investment. And the reason is it's very expensive to be providing electric power from a centralized plant when you in rural parts of the developing world. And so that's where, ta-da, distributed generation comes into play, and, you know, having these great rooftop systems that Zach spends his life championing. The other point I'd make is that we can't cross out. I think sometimes there is this tendency that we become so bullish about a certain technology that we then think that it will become the dominant resource. But I think really to underscore point Zach's raised, that we are going to have a diversified mix over the coming decades. And there will be a need for utility scale energy. My hope is it will be principally utility scale renewable energy with storage, utility scale storage, and which will have many different manifestations. And that will be necessary to power industry and to power large, really industry is principally what we need to think about in terms of these utility scale sources. So in the developing world, to provide power to places that have large poor populations, from my vantage point, it's going to be a mix of distributed generation and utility scale, primarily renewable energy.
Yeah, I just to add on to that and maybe bring it a little closer to home and think about the energy burden that's experienced by low income and otherwise marginalized or vulnerable populations here in the United States. What we're seeing is that coal is an increasingly expensive energy source. It's basically impossible to finance new coal plants. Managing the old existing coal plants is becoming increasingly expensive, and then the resources that are required to actually produce energy at those coal plants, including all the inputs of coal and water and other resources, are just continuing to drive costs up and up. And so renewables being cheaper to build today than it is to just run a coal plant, offer the opportunity to lower costs for everybody, just on the side of how much we're paying for the electric bill, which is even more important for folks who put more of their income towards their energy bills each month, because they have lower overall incomes and the energy costs are relatively fixed. And then there's all of the other externalities of air and water quality, of economic opportunity, of carbon emissions that we've been talking about as well. So I think that the reality is that renewable energy is both cheaper to build and operate, and also has other external benefits beyond pure economics that make it definitely more cost-effective and beneficial than coal or natural gas being the kind of base of our energy system for the future.
Thank you both for sharing. Does anyone have any questions about this statement or any of the previous slides?
Yeah, I would like to. I just want to say thank you, Zach and Jesse. I don't know if you can make a comment about Michael Moore's movie, Planet of the Humans, if either of you have seen it. But just being part of this has really helped me to put that more in perspective, because it really threw me for a loop when I did see just the resource intensiveness, as you've spoken to already. And just the fact that, yeah, we're on a continuum of getting better and better and better and better as we go. But I just would love to hear if either of you have an opinion on that movie. Thank you.
Well, I have not seen the film, but I have read and consumed a good deal of criticism of the film. So that would be what would inform my opinion. So I don't know, Jesse, if you've seen it and want to comment firsthand, it might be more appropriate to your question.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Michael, for the question. Good to see you. I have seen the film, and I guess I came in thinking it was going to be extremely bad because my friends who work in the industry were extremely critical of it. But I think that it is a helpful contribution to the public debate. I think that where it is strong is in its summary of the array of environmental impacts of renewable energy technology, the environmental harm of renewable energy technology. Where it is very flawed is really not meaningfully speaking to the array of benefits of renewable energy technology, whether that's in terms of public health or in terms of jobs in places that have seen a lot of economic dislocation, or whether that is in terms of the central question of decarbonization, of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it is fair in spotlighting that we can't have a romanticized view of renewable energy. It has its own impacts. And again, where it's not fair is not even really meaningfully acknowledging the benefits of it. And then I would say one final point is that I do think it is right to be focusing our attention on consumption and on population. Those are, issues that obviously were pretty ascendant in the 1970s as factors that we need to spotlight, and we've become a more gluttonous society in the United States and globally since then. So that is good, but it doesn't really offer any meaningful solutions about how to get there. And this gets back to a theme I've tried to bring in this time together often, and that is price. That we've got to be pricing things at the appropriate level. Virtually all energy technologies are artificially low priced. We need to internalize the costs that various technologies are born so that we get at a true price. If we get at a true price, it will necessarily cause people to reduce their consumption, to put in LED light bulbs everywhere, to bone up on insulation, etc. So this issue of price is intimately tied with this issue of how we reduce consumption.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Thanks very much. Appreciate that. And yeah, absolutely. Do you have ideas about how that can get implemented, bringing price into the equation?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Michael, the central solution to me is what our friends at Citizens Climate Lobby are doing a great job in championing, which is to enact a carbon tax. That's honest in the sense that it is translating a scientific concept of greenhouse gases causing climate change. It monetizes that and causes the industry to be honest. And again, on a per megawatt hour basis or per kilowatt hour basis, coal simply emits more carbon than other technologies, and so it will force utilities through the price signal to shift even more aggressively from fossil fuels to renewables. It's not the entirety of the answer because, again, there's various other environmental impacts that are not fully monetized, but it's the central issue.
Another question popped in the chat, and it said that going back to slide number 7 and considering typical temperature and pressure differences between the land and the water, would the Great Lakes be a viable location for offshore wind?
There's been some discussion of offshore wind in Lake Michigan and some of the other Great Lakes. I don't know the current status. I think part of it is that, these are obviously going to be such enormous capital investments, and, the balance sheets are going to be impacted, and just the financing is going to be impacted by the existence or non-existence of a production tax credit, which again has been around since the late 1970s, but has been really very unstable. So that's been part of what's at play. I would just underscore another point, which I hadn't really raised before, which is this issue that localities matter, right? They matter with respect to where we would site a coal plant, but they should also matter where we site a wind farm or a solar plant. So if there's an outcry among communities along Lake Michigan that we don't want offshore wind, that's got to be honored. We can't force that upon them. That doesn't seem right.
Thank you for answering. Are there any other questions that anyone has? Right, I don't think there's any more questions, but I just want to thank everyone for coming and for Jesse and Zach for presenting on the panel. And I'm going to give it to Dory to talk about our upcoming events with Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for putting this together, and Zach and Jesse for answering all of our many questions, kind of alleviating that stress about when we hear these doubts in our mind about renewables. That's really helped. So HIPPL has a lot of programs coming up, including July 12th, we'll be having a Using Energy Prudently workshop hosted by the Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation. And Michael has been instrumental in helping organize that. We're excited about that. And then Sarah will be leading some fantastic programming throughout July, including hopefully a film screening, although we were considering the film you were all talking about today, and we'll look deeper into other options. And then Blake, who's our public policy intern, who's online, also is helping organize an environmental, socially responsible investing workshop for how to vote, not just with your vote in November on the ballot, but also with your financial resources. So please continue to check us out on the web, and I think most of you are on our listserv, but if not, just let us know and we'll get you linked up. So thanks for joining today. Yeah, everybody have a great weekend.